Coming up this week on Success Won't Come Calling.
Criticisms of the EU are built on a sort of funny, false equation. And the equation is there's only a certain amount of power and influence in the world, and the cake has to be divided between the people who exist currently. And so everyone can only have a particular share, and once that share is divided out, that's it. So there have to be winners and there have to be losers in fixed proportions. Well, that's just not the way the world works.
Hello friends, Simon Gibson here. Welcome to SWCC. Hope you're all well. If you like the podcast, please click subscribe and you will know the moment every one of our episode lands. 12 months or so, the United Kingdom finally withdrew from the European Union. It's, as I say, it's a year on, and what I wanted to do as part of this episode is look at what's gone well, what's gone badly, what opportunities there are to change things for the greater good in the future, and also whether the issue of the European Union is one which will affect other countries in Europe in the same way that it has affected our own. We clearly need some expert help to guide us through the various issues. I'm delighted to say that my guest this week is Professor Michael Dougan. Michael is a professor of European law at the University of Liverpool. He's been there since 2004. In addition to that, he's also acted as an expert witness to both the Cabinet and a number of parliamentary select committees on matters of European law. He's also joint editor of the Common Law Market Review, which is one of the most well-renowned publications on matters European law related in the world. And Michael also in the past has worked on a consultancy basis with the BBC in terms of fact-checking any issues connected with European law. So, Michael, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thanks a lot for having me.
Not at all. Well, we were just talking off air, and our Prime Minister Boris Johnson here in the UK, he's done our work for us today, because I'm holding up for those who are just listening to this the daily media today. It's in quite a lot of the papers. It's the 31st of January 2022, and the headline here is Boris vows to unleash the benefits of Brexit. And there's very similar headlines in a number of the main media. And this is all to do with a new bill that I understand is being presented to Parliament in the UK, which is called the Brexit Freedoms Bill. I've not seen any of the text, but certainly in terms of what's being reported in the media, this is going to be great news, according to the government, that it's going to mean less red tape in areas such as data, in terms of climate. There'd be a better and more open world for businesses to trade in. So I guess in some respects, it's repeating many of the case for the UK to leave the EU in the first place. So, Michael, are you reading, whilst acknowledging that you've not had access to the bill yet, are you reading this news with optimism or with scepticism?
I think with a very large dose of skepticism. I think first of all we should acknowledge that there are a few details here. It's really an extended press release from the UK government, and we haven't seen the text of the bill, and we haven't got that much detail about what's intended. Even in the text that we do have, there's the usual Boris Johnson trademark of a whole series of half-truths and semi-truths and quarter-truths and total untruths. And misrepresentations. There are plenty of all of those. I think it's tempting to look at this announcement as a bit of a distraction. It's clearly a bit premature. The text is not actually available, and the plans are not particularly well formulated. It's tempting to think that this is just part of the general save Boris Johnson's job distraction strategy, which is well timed to coincide with the imminent publication of the report into Partygate. But I think when you actually look at the details, there is a lot more to it than that, and there's a lot that we should be positively worried about, because from what we can work out, there's two things which this bill proposes to do. The first is to further centralise power in the hands of ministers at the expense of Parliament. That's been a trend, particularly around Brexit and under Boris Johnson, the further sidelining and belittling of Parliament. contrary, of course, to what the Brexitists promised when they won the referendum. It was all about taking back control and making Parliament sovereign again. Actually, this bill would increase ministerial powers to change the law rather than parliamentary responsibility for doing that. And the second thing, of course, is that what the government defines as red tape, the rest of us would define as basic workers' rights, basic standards of environmental protection, basic safeguards for consumers, the regulation of financial markets, almost anything which we'd think of as being a standard that's there to protect the public and safeguard our interests could be categorized as red tape under these proposals. So I think for those two reasons, the fact that it would help centralize power even further in the hands of ministers, and it would potentially allow them to change substantial parts of our basic rights and regulatory standards, we should all be watching this development with very skeptical eyes indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to flag that we don't have the detail yet. It sounds as if there's a number of areas that Parliament will need to scrutinise very carefully. And you just wonder, don't you, whether the fact that the referendum happened, the decision was made, the majority has spoken, you wonder whether some members of the cabinet, for example, who were Remainers, might apply that same scrutiny. I guess that all remains to be seen. But just with one point I wanted to make, Michael, I mean, we're here, we're 5 years after the referendum. Like I said, that happened. I don't propose that we rehash the respective parties' Leave and Remain cases. What we're here to do today is to take a pit stop and to ask ourselves, where are we now in terms of our withdrawal from the European Union? What has gone well? What hasn't? How can it be improved? You know, the podcast is all about us achieving goals through struggle. So if there is an opportunity for our country to make the best of the deal that we've got, then I'd be certainly keen to get your views on that. But just first of all, Michael, when you took a look at it's called the Withdrawal and Cooperation Act, isn't it? The actual piece of legislation which led to us finally agreeing terms and leaving the European Union. Well,
there's two separate treaties really that we'll have to think about when we're talking about the arrangements for the UK's withdrawal. The earlier one was the actual withdrawal agreement. And this was the agreement that made specific arrangements for the UK's withdrawal from the EU. It's a fairly limited agreement in the sense that it really was dealing with a lot of immediate problems. You know, what do you do with a ship full of goods, which it's on its way to France, to the UK on the day of Brexit? What rules govern it? Does it pay customs duties? Does it doesn't? A lot of nitty-gritty stuff like that. But it also contained two very important sets of bigger provisions. First of all, the rules on what would happen to UK citizens living across the EU and the EU citizens living in the UK into the future. What would happen to the people who'd already moved between the two territories and their families, their rights to work, their rights to employment, to social security, to education, and so on. And then the second big set of provisions, which the withdrawal agreement contains, are the rules on Northern Ireland and the whole Northern Ireland Protocol and the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Now, those were all dealt with in the withdrawal agreement itself. But then separate from the withdrawal agreement is the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And it's the agreement which was signed around a year afterwards, after the UK had already left the EU, but while we were still in the transitional phase when not very much had actually happened in practice. And it's the treaty which governs the future of UK-EU relations as a whole in fields like trade, in fields like customs, in fields like criminal cooperation between police forces and so on. And so really we're talking about these two separate agreements. The withdrawal agreement, the earlier one, which is much more focused on a series of particular issues, and then the much more far-reaching and future-looking agreement, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is much bigger in scope, more wide-ranging in nature.
Got you. Obviously those agreements have been signed now, so that they are what they are. But one of the, I guess, the mantras of the Leave campaign was this issue of us taking back our sovereignty, our ability to make our own laws for our own country and to take decisions in the best interest of the British people. I just wondered, the vaccine rollout, the COVID vaccine rollout, bearing in mind that for everyone concerned, we're talking about this in 2022, early 2022, where this is still a topical issue. My impression of the vaccine rollout was that the UK did a far better job than the EU. And I say that because the EU were locked in litigation with the various vaccine companies. There was all manner of suggestions that the EU had delayed in terms of placing their order, or perhaps that they hadn't been clear enough on what their order was. There was a number of counter arguments going the other way from the EU. And during this time, our government, whatever we think of the vaccine, which is a separate issue, it seemed to me that our government did a half decent job of just getting the vaccine out there. And I just thought to myself, whatever we think of the withdrawal from the EU, it does sound like they're a clunky, bureaucratic organisation, which certainly in terms of the vaccine, just didn't do things quickly enough. And I just wondered to myself, is this ability to be light on our feet and nimble in terms of decision making, is that a cause for some optimism in the future if the vaccine strategy was applied to other issues by the government?
Okay, on this specific issue of the vaccine rollout, I'm not a public health lawyer and I'm not an empiricist, and I don't particularly know the ins and outs of who negotiated what with whom and when. Suffice to say that there are quite a few member states of the EU that have higher vaccination rates than the UK does, and pretty much every single state in the EU has a lower death rate than the UK does. So I'm not sure what if that greater nimbleness and flexibility has come at the price of greater deaths. I'm not sure it's such a great triumph to boast about. But I think maybe the point that you're making, if we set aside the issue of the vaccine, which isn't my field at all, and I'm just sort of being a little bit facetious in response, I think what we've got to do here is think about what the price of this idea of sovereignty is. And I think there's a couple of points that we can make. The first point is the UK never lost its sovereignty. The UK never stopped being a sovereign state. Parliament never stopped being the sovereign lawmaking authority for the UK. What the UK did was join an organisation voluntarily of its own free will in which it cooperated with other countries to deal with various issues of trade, of security, of foreign policy, of environment and climate crisis, and so on. And to try and reach agreements to solve common problems, you have to make certain sacrifices and offer certain commitments. And that's what the EU is all about. Now, obviously, EU membership involves commitments on a big scale. This is not just tiny little agreements. This is about making quite significant commitments to address things together. Now, you could say then, what's the converse effect of taking back control and getting back your sovereignty, the stuff that you never lost? What it effectively means is you're going to cooperate less with other people. So the price of being light on your feet or more flexible is that you lose the capacity to problem solve with others, and you lose the strength in numbers that comes from being part of a big club. Now, the question for the UK is, are those benefits, the benefits of being lighter on its feet, do they outweigh the costs of effective problem solving with your neighbours and of having the strength and safety in numbers that comes from being part of a much bigger collective club? Now, that's a judgment which is obviously very complicated because there are all sorts of aspects. And as you'd expect, you might say that there are gains to be made in one field and losses to be incurred in another. But the principle, I think, is fairly straightforward for most people to get. Of course, there are certain benefits to being on your own, but there are also huge problems with being on your own. And I suppose the experience of many countries is it's better to do things together than it is to do things individually, because often you just can't address the challenges individually at all. And often the response that you provide will not be as effective as what you manage to do in cooperation with other people. We all know this instinctively as individuals, but it's also true of countries as well.
Yeah, I take your point on the vaccine, Michael. I suppose what's the point of getting your vaccination strategy right, which perhaps our government did, when you've already made a series of highly questionable decisions, which related to lockdowns and border closures and that sort of thing. So I think that's a fair point. But just looking at the bigger picture in terms of what you've said around sovereignty, I'm not a parliamentarian. I'm not an expert in European law, so I approach this issue on decision-making from a business perspective. I'm CEO of the Spirant Group, and when we need decisions in the business, I find that the fewer people who are involved in that process, the smoother it can be, because decisions by committee are challenging. That doesn't mean, of course, that you don't involve people, but you want to minimise that sort of trying to herd cats that can occur when you've got a committee of people. Is there any of that cat herding decision by committee which the EU could be accused of? Do you think?
I think all of us could be accused of that at some stage in our lives. I think it's probably more important again to sort of set aside the quest for incriminating examples of things that we would like to complain about, because we can find that about anything we want to in the entire world. I think it's more important maybe to focus on the issue of what it is the business problem that we're talking about here. And I think we should probably be dead clear. States are not businesses, and they're not run like businesses. They don't face the same challenges businesses. And interstate relations, particularly in the field of international trade, are about addressing the problems that businesses face through the existence of sovereignty. That's effectively what international trade is about. Trade barriers, trade problems are caused by the sovereignty of international relations. International trade agreements are about trying to find ways to solve the problems to trade, the problems to business that are created through the exercise of sovereignty. Now, really, our attention generally in the public debate, certainly in the UK, tends to focus on all the easy stuff. Customs tariffs, customs barriers, physical lorries waiting at the border. That's the stuff which is obvious. It's the stuff that we tend to focus on. But actually, they're the easy problems of trade. Are you going to throw a tax on an import or are you not? That's an easy question. And once you've decided you're going to tax an import, the only question is how much tax are you going to charge? They're not difficult problems. They're not difficult solutions either. Stop charging taxes. The real problems in international trade are about differences in the way that different territories regulate and make laws. We allow a certain type of chemical to be used, you don't. We allow a certain type of lawyer to practice, you don't. We allow a certain type of business to offer financial products, you won't let that happen. Those aren't like customs barriers. They're not border problems. They're just problems because states do things differently and they have different rules. And that means that a business in one country can't do the same job in another country without having to readapt itself to all of the rules and requirements of that other territory. And obviously, there aren't just one or two territories in the world. There are over 150 territories in the world, all with their own different rules, their own different regulations. So the main problem in international trade is actually how to find ways to overcome the trade barriers that exist because countries do things differently. And the EU's main responsibility, if you like, is to find ways of dealing with the existence of 27 different sets of rules for the manufacture of every conceivable good, for the provision of every conceivable service, for the conduct of every particular profession. And there are various tools that you can use to do that. The main one which the EU uses is called mutual recognition. It basically means we'll recognize your standards as pretty much equivalent to ours. So if you manufacture a good, we'll accept it too. If you provide a service, we'll assume that you're doing a good job of doing that and let the service be provided in our territory as well. That's the way the EU basically runs the system. But the fact is, international trade, the problems of international trade are because of state sovereignty. And the way that you help solve the problems of international trade is by reaching compromises on state sovereignty. And to be frank, it's a little bit of a contradictory argument to say that you want to respect state sovereignty by just having simple ways of reaching agreement, because the simple way to reach agreement is to ignore the small and weak countries and impose your will upon them as the bigger, stronger countries. And then you're not really talking about sovereignty at all. Then you're just talking about brutal, uncivilized international bullying. So I think we've got to be sort of careful about what it is we're talking about as a problem. We're talking about how countries have to work together in order to overcome the inevitable problems that arise because we all do things differently, and that creates barriers. And I think we have to be realistic about the solutions. The solutions come through dialogue, negotiation, compromise, agreement, commitments. That's what the EU is. It's a system of dialogue, compromise, commitment. It's bigger and more sophisticated than, for example, other regional trade agreements that you might think of. But in essence, that's essentially what the EU does.
I hear you, but isn't the reality that when we were in the EU, that issue, I mean, I think bullying is far too strong a word for the point I want to make, but you had the big three, didn't you, as they were called? There was the UK, there was France, and there was Germany. I mean, that small group of big beasts, they call the shots, didn't they? Economically, financially. How much of a say in this cooperative structure do some of the smaller players have, and did they have? Is that really the utopia that the compromise utopia that you referred to?
I think it's interesting if you were to wonder what type of influence a country like Ireland would have in the development of international trade and European relations on its own, and then ask what influence and power a country like Ireland has as a member state of the EU. I think you'll find that Ireland's power and influence is magnified many times over through its EU membership than it is by being on its own. The EU is built on criticisms of the EU are built on a sort of funny, false equation. And the equation is there's only a certain amount of power and influence in the world, and the cake has to be divided between the people who exist currently. And so everyone can only have a particular share, and once that share is divided out, that's it. So there have to be winners and there have to be losers in fixed proportions. Well, that's just not the way the world works. One of the lessons of not just the EU, but other forms of regional cooperation as well, of which the EU is an example, of course, is that when you cooperate together through effective structures according to a balanced system, the big countries get more influence because they have, in the case of the UK as it was, France and Germany, they weren't just 3 countries acting together internationally, they were 28 countries acting together internationally under their coordinated leadership. But equally, the smaller countries were all more powerful and influential as well because they each had a much better representation around the table than they would have had if they weren't at the table at all. And so this idea that power and influence is finite and you can only have a particular share of it is a bit of a sort of popular fantasy. Actually, cooperation magnifies power and influence for all of the people involved. It makes the leaders stronger, but it also makes the less powerful countries more influential than they would be otherwise as well. Now, one of the main effects, if you like, of Brexit is that the UK was the sort of natural leader, if you like, of a whole range of countries. By the way, in the EU, there's no such thing as a stable alliance of East or West or North or South or big or small. The countries are constantly renegotiating with each other and forming different alliances for different purposes strategically as different agendas change. But the UK, generally speaking, was the sort of natural leader for a particular category of countries, such as Ireland, the Netherlands, Sweden, some of the countries in Eastern Europe, that tended to be more economically liberal, more skeptical about state intervention, maybe less keen on certain initiatives, more keen on others. And one of the effects of Brexit within the EU, of course, has been that by removing the UK from the equation, a lot of those smaller countries have had to sort of realign their interests within the EU itself. They've got to decide whether they're going to perhaps follow more of the lead of Germany or more of the lead of France, whether they're actually going to work closer together in a coalition. which doesn't necessarily involve one of the big two. So the UK's departure has definitely affected the internal dynamics of how the EU operates. There's no doubt about that. But I think this sort of idea that you have the bullies and the bullied, as if it was a sort of school playground, is maybe a rather simplified understanding of how the system works.
So it was about providing sort of positive leadership experience rather than bringing any particular power to bear. I get you. It's interesting you just on this issue of how we're having to rearrange ourselves. I don't think it was Boris Johnson, but it was certainly someone in the cabinet suggesting relatively recently that the UK could positively influence this awful crisis that's building in Ukraine more effectively outside of the European Union than they could within it. And I mean, just to, I guess, to signpost this, we're by the time this podcast comes out, we'll be in mid-February, and unfortunately, this situation in Ukraine between them and Russia might have escalated by then. What's your view on that? Are we in a position where we can more positively influence out than in?
Honestly, I think anyone who thinks that Vladimir Putin is other than absolutely delighted and thrilled by Brexit needs their head examining. Brexit has not just caused an enormous amount of damage to Western unity, which it has, of course it has. That's obvious, and anyone who tries to deny it really does need their head examining. I think we need to sort of break down some of the things that Brexit has done, and especially the form of Brexit that's being pursued by Boris Johnson. We should remember Brexit didn't have to end this way. There were a range of possible Brexits that could have happened. The Brexit we've ended up with is the most extreme, the most tense and antagonistic that really was on the table. And to be frank, the Brexit we've ended up with was the sort of Brexit that was only mooted by the most lunatic on the Leave fringes during the referendum campaign itself. None of the mainstream Brexitists argued for the type of Brexit that we've ended up with. What have we ended up with? We've ended up with the UK itself being much more isolated, much more exposed, exercising much less influence because it is relatively isolated than it did before. We've ended up with the EU itself being weakened, particularly on the geopolitical front, because the EU has lost a major member state, and that has diluted the power of the EU. And we've ended up, more seriously than that, with a relationship between the EU and the UK, which is primarily the doing of Boris Johnson, which is almost designed to encourage tension and confrontation and antagonism. How any of those things can possibly help in the West confronting a monster like Vladimir Putin and his aggressive geopolitical designs on Eastern Europe, it really does defy logical belief how anyone could believe that Brexit has been anything other than a damaging part of this. And of course, we'll get the whole, but we're more light-footed, we're more flexible, we can adapt more easily. Like I said before, it's brilliant if you can do a pirouette and then get punched in the face by Vladimir Putin, but the pirouette itself, light-footed and flexible as it might be, doesn't do anybody much good.
No, and he's a strange guy, Putin, isn't he?
Oh, he's a monster. He's a monster.
Have you got a view on why he takes so many photos of himself bare-chested on horses? Have you ever seen those photos of it? It's as if he's trying to make some sort of leadership point, but a bit of an evolutionary point.
If I have more of an insight into the psychology of monsters, I'd probably understand it better. But Putin is a really dangerous character. Has been for a long time, and there's no sign that his danger is diminishing.
The thing which worries me about Putin, and I mean I think there's good cause to query the veracity of the elections which occur in Russia, but I get the impression that if they had a legitimate election, he might well still get in. Which I think underlines just the extent of his power.
It's difficult when anyone who opposes him is poisoned or locked up. It's difficult to know, but yeah. Yeah,
he's definitely not a man for compromise and negotiation, is he? That's for sure. I just wanted to run a few issues by you, Michael, just to get your views on. I mean, one, I found a persuasive argument in terms of us remaining in the European Union was that to pull the drawbridge up on the freedom of movement of labour within the union was going to lead to a shortage of of labour in the United Kingdom. I just wanted, Jacob, have you got that link? I think is it Lidl or Aldi have made this announcement quite recently. Jacob's just getting it up, but fundamentally, I mean, and this isn't the only example of this that we're seeing, but my general impression is that employers in the here it is. So Lidl gives pay rise to 21,000 employees. My understanding of this is that they're applying a minimum wage for their staff, which is over and above that which they need to pursuant to the regulations. I just wondered, is there a case here that whilst that may have been a very plausible argument from Remainers that restricted freedom of movement would present a much more competitive employee market in the UK, are we seeing a positive emerging here that businesses in this country are going to have to finally do away with 0 hours contracts, finally look after their employees, pay them properly, give them a journey to be proud of? So is this perhaps an unintended positive of the departure from the European Union, or an unexpected positive?
Well, first of all, I'm not, a bit like with your vaccine rollout question, I'm not an empiricist, and I'm not I don't know the detail of the particular example you're talking about. Suffice to say, there are lots and lots of countries in Europe which don't have a workforce that struggles on a terrible minimum wage and insecure jobs with poor productivity and with potential exploitation by unscrupulous employers. Those are choices which were made by successive UK governments about how to structure the UK's labour market. So if you want to create a correlation between addressing those types of issues and Brexit, I think it's a false correlation. Those problems were not caused by the UK's membership of the EU. Otherwise, all the other states of Europe would have similar problems, and they don't, because they didn't choose those policies for themselves. They're an expression of parliamentary sovereignty and British control. So conversely, I think it's difficult to say that there's a clear causal relationship between addressing those problems and leaving the EU. The UK could have stayed in the EU and addressed those problems, but it chose a different path. And I think, therefore, the causal relationship isn't at all clear. I think what we do know is that these issues around free movement aren't just about economics, important as the economics are, because we know that ending free movement rights between the EU and the UK has also caused enormous disruption to the lives of millions of people. We know it's cut short the personal aspirations of millions of people in the UK who wanted to go and work and live and travel or retire across the rest of Europe. And those plans and aspirations and hopes and dreams have all been cut short as well. So important as the economic questions are, and to be frank, although I'm not an empiricist, the balance of the economic equation from those who are empiricists is very clearly that the ending of free movement is a bit of a disaster, like most of the rest of the economic story here. We have to focus on the wider picture. And the wider picture is that millions of people's lives and aspirations and plans and dreams have all been thrown onto the bonfire. And that's much more difficult to calculate in economic terms. It is also very important.
Yeah. I mean, I've got to say that strikes a chord with me. A friend of mine, she was in the process of buying property in Spain when the sort of detail all began to emerge, and certainly these visa requirements. I think you capped at 90 days. You can spend 90 days in Spain in any given year unless you apply for residency. I mean, that is a downside, isn't it? Because, you know, the ability to spend time in different countries relatively close to you, unrestricted, potentially, you know, set businesses up there, spend time there and setting the businesses up. That does seem to me to be, it's difficult for me to think of a positive spin that could be put on that.
I think here in Liverpool and generally in the north of England, there are various effects of the ending of free movement, which are maybe not that obvious to a lot of people. but certainly they're important to people like me working in a sector like higher education. One of the things that we're being told quite regularly by the people who we have to take for granted they know what they're talking about is that young people and students in the north of England and general and Liverpool in particular can be held back by a sort of lack of international experience and a lack of international exposure. And the values that brings to their attitudes, their experience, their mindset, their aspirations, and so on. And so one of the big challenges for us in the north of England is to try and recreate or at least compensate for the types of opportunities which wealthier people in wealthier parts of the country take almost for granted, but our young people and students don't enjoy anywhere near as much. And to be frank, free movement played an enormously important part in that. And we're not just talking here about our students, our young people going over to various countries in Europe. We're also talking often more realistically about large numbers of Europeans coming to our universities and wanting to study with our students, because often for people who aren't very well off and who can't afford to take a year out and travel the world because they're just not in a financial position to do so, their international experience was actually made up of meeting other Europeans at university, studying with them, learning from them, broadening cultures, making friendships, establishing networks. And so the loss of free movement and the demise of European students in the UK, which the data suggests has been quite significant, also impacts upon our young people and our students because they're missing out on opportunities which could be really valuable to their lives and their future productivity and their future professional life. So there are all sorts of hidden problems and hidden costs which come with these Brexit-related decisions, which maybe aren't that obvious and maybe don't get much public attention, but you certainly feel the tangible effects of them in your daily life, in my daily life.
Yeah, I mean, that resonates with me. And it's difficult to calculate the impact of that, isn't it? Because when you do, particularly during university years or just when you're young, you meet people from different countries, different cultures. You do learn ever such a lot. And it does tend to shape your view of the world and your view of diversity. So, you know, I can totally resonate with, well, that resonates with me that's perhaps a problem which isn't spoken about enough. You made a really interesting comment just a little while before, Michael, about the causal link between events that are happening in this country and Brexit itself. I just wondered if I could turn that argument sort of on its head slightly, insofar as I have heard a number of people say that this government's attempts, for example, to restrict the authority of the judiciary in the United Kingdom and to restrict the right of protest in the UK, that this all is really a consequence of the autonomy or the greater degree of independence that we've gained through Brexit. I'm not convinced by that argument, to be honest with you, because I think that is more of a consequence of the majority voting this government in, rather than the decision in the referendum excuse me, to leave the EU. Sorry. What I mean by that is, even if we didn't know what we were getting when the majority voted to leave the EU, surely we knew what we were getting when at the end of 2019, this government were voted in with a remarkable majority. Is it right now that we complain about these sort of actions? Wasn't these sort of challengeable and arguably disreputable types of policy and inevitability once the majority voted this government in?
I mean, Simon, I'll definitely agree that there's no inherent connection between Brexit and the range of, frankly, and in many cases, anti-democratic policies which are being pursued by the government. You mentioned restrictions on our rights to protest. There are plans afoot to change the basis of our fundamental rights. There are considerable attacks on the judiciary, both politically and through the proposals on judicial review, also directly upon the ability of the judges to hold the government to account. There are a whole range of really difficult issues afoot. Now, frankly, none of those have happened because of Brexit. I agree with you there. And in fact, nearly all of them could have happened even if we'd voted Remain instead within the EU itself. We see from the experience of countries like Hungary and Poland that it's perfectly possible to be a member state of the EU and to have an anti-liberal, anti-democratic government in control, which is causing mayhem with your basic status as a functioning liberal democracy. So I agree with you there. I think, however, although there's no inherent connection between Brexit and the types of proposals and reforms and attacks that we see under the Johnson government, there is, of course, a coherent programme at work, because many of the main Leave supporters who are now in government and surrounding Boris Johnson and among his most fervent supporters simply don't believe that much in liberal democracy. And they don't particularly have that much respect for our fundamental rights, for our fundamental freedoms, for the idea of democratic scrutiny and accountability of executive power. All of the things that many of us would see as core to the identity of a liberal democracy. And many of them, rightly or wrongly, thought that EU membership was to blame for why their political programme was not advancing as rapidly as it could do, and believed that it would be easier to advance that political programme outside the EU than it would be in it. It is part of a pattern of behaviour, even if there isn't much of an inherent link between the two. But I think there's one important thing that we should bear in mind. You said, that Boris Johnson got a great majority at the last election. He got a great majority in Parliament, but that's because our first past the post electoral system basically guarantees that having a moderate minority of the vote, the public vote, translates into a great majority in Parliament. And a great majority in Parliament in our frankly medievalist constitutional system translates into the ability to wreak havoc with the country as a whole, with very little accountability and scrutiny, with a determined government that is simply uninterested in being held accountable or being scrutinised. But I think we should remind ourselves that actually only a minority of people in this country voted for Boris Johnson and what he stood for. And that majority does not deserve what they're getting at the minute, even if the people who voted for him should have known what they were voting for.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a great fan of first past the post, but hasn't that argument been fought and lost? And aren't we just stuck with this? And if people, as a majority within that electoral system, do vote for someone like Boris and this party, isn't that actually a consequence of democracy rather than an attack upon it?
It's a form of democracy if you believe that first past the post within the context of a system which is based almost entirely on untrammeled executive power through the figment of parliamentary sovereignty is a form of democracy. I'll give you that. Those of us who think that democracy has a bit more substance and needs a bit more protecting and has certain fragilities that need to be positively safeguarded against the whims of a electoral majority or the behaviour of a government which doesn't actually think very much of scrutiny and accountability. If you think that democracy means more than just having a certain number of votes in a certain institution on a given day of a 4-year or 5-year cycle, then I'm afraid what we're seeing at the minute is not particularly worthy of our support and respect. One of the key ideas of a democracy is that we're entitled to criticise and challenge. And what we're doing here is criticising and challenging the idea that just because a certain number of votes are cast for Boris Johnson on a certain day for a certain institution, that gives him the right to restrict judicial review and allow the government to behave unlawfully. It gives him the right to sideline Parliament at will and to insult anybody who stands in his way. It gives him the right to undermine our fundamental rights and take away our right to protest. Those things aren't particularly democratic. And I think it's difficult to defend them on the basis that a majority in Parliament are willing to vote for them.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting you're making this point that us having a right to criticise and a right to challenge, which I completely agree with. Isn't part of the problem here, though, that those who should be doing this at political level, both historically as part of the referendum at the 2019 election and continuing, are offering quite feeble opposition, that even if we get to the next election in a couple of years and we all go back to the ballot box, isn't there a real risk that until such time that these opposition parties can either get together and start talking in a civilized fashion and presenting some form of viable alternative, or that Boris departs and someone who perhaps is a bit more of a fan of democratic governance and scrutiny comes in? Aren't we just at risk here of being in a vicious circle that this will just continue as without an alternative?
I think that's a very political question that I'm not particularly well qualified to answer. I think, well, a couple of points. First of all, I'm not entirely sure what sort of opposition is being offered to Boris Johnson, because, quite frankly, most of the media would never report it, even if there was. I get no sense of a balanced representation of the political debate in this country, because much of the media has no interest in offering a balanced representation of political debate. Secondly, and more importantly, I think is a point about sort of the natural conservatism of lawyers reaching its limit. I think most lawyers by nature tend to be a little bit naturally conservative, and I mean with a small c, not with a capital C, in the sense that if something works, we don't see the point in breaking it just to fix small bits. If things are capable of being made to work, we prefer small fixes. We don't like radical change for the sake of radical change. I think one of the things that I've learned over the experience of the last 10 years or so is that actually the UK would probably benefit from quite a radical degree of constitutional reform. What I would really like to see is the opposition parties reaching an agreement that what's actually needed for the UK is a constitutional convention to consider the possibility of a written constitution with properly entrenched independence of the judiciary and its ability to scrutinise government, proper safeguards for political and social minorities, a proper entrenched Charter of Rights, which can't be changed at the whim of a government with an 80-seat majority, proper restrictions on the executive and proper accountability for corruption and the abuse of power, all of the things that we used to take for granted in this country, more through informal conventions and political understanding. And I think one of the things we've learned over the past 10 years or so is that an unwritten constitution that relies on people acting like good chaps and having decent morals isn't very effective when you're confronted by a political leadership that doesn't seem to have any particular morals and has no interest in self-restraint. So I think one of the experiences for me is that my natural conservatism as a lawyer has been overcome by the experience of Boris Johnson and his cohort. And I think we probably need a much more radical program of constitutional reform to really entrench the type of democracy and the type of society that we like to think our country is, but it's been shown to be really quite surprisingly and maybe even frighteningly fragile by the experience of such an immoral political leader as Boris Johnson has proven himself to be.
It's an interesting constitutional point you make there, because by way of comparison, I'm no fan of Donald Trump, and clearly in America, there were a number of consequences of his leadership which were quite catastrophic and horrific. However, I suppose you could run an argument that from a medium and long-term perspective, the Constitution provided various safeguards which prevented him from doing any, it prevented him from perhaps wreaking the havoc that he could have done in a system such as ours. Is that something you agree with?
To a degree. I mean, I think there are lots of, we know the good lawyers among us that there are always dangers to drawing parallels and comparisons, because there are often lots of background factors which influence why one country does something one way and another does it a different way. I think in some respects, what you said is completely true. That the American Constitution imposed checks and balances on Donald Trump that, frightening thought as it is, limited some of the worst damage that he could have done. I think in some respects, an interesting parallel with the UK is what's happening in Poland with the Polish government's assault on the independence of the judiciary. The Polish government wants to hobble the judiciary and the judiciary's ability to criticize or hold the government to account in Poland. Now, because the judiciary's independence and its power of judicial review and its ability to scrutinise government action are constitutionally protected, how does the government basically go about it? By getting rid of the judges who criticise it and replacing them with loyal mouthpieces of the government itself. In a way, the UK, Boris Johnson, that is, doesn't need to attack the judiciary head on. All it needs to do is pass legislation that excludes judicial review by the judiciary of the government. We can still have the independent judiciary of wonderful, high qualified judges, and they can still be independent and they can still be well qualified and they're not government puppets. But if they don't actually have the power to question the government anymore, it achieves the same result. So I think there are maybe better than the sort of parallel with Trump is the contrast with Poland. The Polish need to attack their judiciary because they have a constitution that protects the judiciary. Boris Johnson doesn't need to attack the judiciary because there's no constitution to protect them. He can simply legislate to make them a virtual irrelevancy when it comes to certain forms of scrutiny and holding the government to account. And I think that's the real danger of the UK constitution, because it doesn't have entrenched protections. We rely on the good behaviour and the gentlemanly conduct of our political leaders in order to make the system work. And when you have someone like Boris Johnson, who is neither gentlemanly nor of good conduct, the system begins to creak and strain and potentially fall apart at the edges.
Yeah. I think we're at the point where we have to start thinking about the future in terms of we are where we are. What are the potential for positive improvement, even for those listening who think there have been positive improvement? And I've raised a few points, I think, on their behalf, which you've responded to very eloquently. Let me ask you, I'm sure you've been asked this before, Michael. It's clear that you are very much in favour of the previous system of us being members of the European Union. Do you see any positives whatsoever in terms of our withdrawal from that organisation?
The main positive, I think, is actually for the rest of Europe. I think it's probably better that the UK left rather than just continue to be a bad influence on the inside. And conversely, I'm not a big supporter of the UK rejoining the EU in the near future, because frankly, I think the UK needs to sort out its very serious political, social and economic problems and actually re-earn its place back within the EU in the future. So I think if we're talking about sort of how do we make things better, I think here that there are a series of dilemmas. I mean, what we've ended up with, we've said it before, is effectively an extreme Brexit of the type that very few Leave campaigners ever advocated back in 2016. Even the most lunatic fringe of the Leave campaign didn't really argue for anything as extreme as what we've ended up with under Boris Johnson. Most Leave campaigners argued for a much softer form of Brexit that would have preserved a much higher degree of cooperation with the EU than what we've ended up with under Boris Johnson. Now, the big dilemma, I suppose, going forward, if we accept that the Brexit we've ended up with is an extremist Brexit, it's caused enormous problems in Northern Ireland. It has caused significant economic weight upon the UK. We haven't even really begun to feel the full extent of the economic disruption which is going to flow from the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. It's undermined Western solidarity and foreign policy and strategic affairs, all of those things. If the question is, how do we make it better? There's a real dilemma at stake here, because how we make it better is by having a softer Brexit, to actually rebuild some of our ties and cooperation with the EU. Now, the big dilemma for the soft Brexiteers is that closer cooperation means exactly what we said before. It means getting back around the table with your partners, accepting commitments, taking on obligations, agreeing to abide by particular rules and processes and standards, agreeing to have stronger institutions and stronger dispute settlement mechanisms. And you really have to ask yourself, is it likely that those standards and those principles are going to be dictated by the UK with its population of 65 million, or are they going to be dictated by the EU with its population of 450 million? Realistically, we know, the world knows, that if you want closer cooperation with the EU, it will largely be on the EU's terms. So the dilemma for the soft Brexiteers is, yes, they can advocate closer cooperation with the EU that will rebuild ties, it will undo some of the economic damage, it will help stabilise the situation in Northern Ireland. But effectively, what the UK will have ended up doing is switching from being a leading rule maker in the EU to becoming a more passive rule taker from the EU. And that's just bonkers, huh? That's bonkers. The idea that we'll end up with a Brexit whereby instead of making the rules, we just follow the rules without having that much of a say in what in their actual formulation, it isn't very sensible. So the soft Brexiteers, I suppose, have a well-meaning programme, but it's inherently unstable. It's inherently unstable because what we're basically saying is the UK will have a close relationship with the EU, but primarily on the EU's terms, whereas once we were at the top table making the rules as well. So is a soft Brexit sustainable in the long term? Probably not. The problem is, as I've said before, the only real alternative then is to rejoin. Now, besides the political problems that would cause within the UK itself, another divisive referendum with another set of poisonous campaigns, more social division, blah, 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 blah. And besides the legal questions that we might be interested in, people like me will be particularly interested in, do we join the single currency? Do we join the Schengen zone? All of that type of stuff. There is the question that I've raised before, will they want us back? And do we actually deserve to be back? Because at the minute, we're not painting a very glorious picture of what it means to be an independent and sovereign country outside the EU. Picture at all of what we'd be like if we were back inside either. The trouble is, it might take us 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to sort out the mess of Boris Johnson's legacy. The EU isn't going to stand there still waiting for us. The EU will continue to evolve, to change, and we don't know what the EU itself will look like in 5 or 10 or 15 and 20 years' time. So we have no idea what it is we'd be even talking about rejoining anyway, let alone whether they'd even want us back. I think my point, I suppose, is, in a very long-winded way, Brexit is a mess that we're going to have to manage for the foreseeable. No easy ways out and no easy solutions. This is all about damage limitation and damage management and trying to make the best of a dreadful set of decisions which have left us in a situation where even very few Leave campaigners thought we would be back in 2016.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because as you've said, this idea that we would even politically get our house in order to the extent that we would ask the EU to rejoin seems fanciful now. And obviously it remains to be seen what would happen if, for example, you get a more centrist prime minister in the future or a changing government. But as you say, very speculative that. Let me just tell you to wrap up. I spoke to loads of friends of mine before this podcast, people who are in business, people who are employed, students. And I said to them, if there was one question you wanted me to ask Michael, what would it be? And certainly the most popular question was this. They said, we think we're stuck with this. How does it actually affect me? So I think where most people have been coming from here is, look, we get all of the arguments why this is an absolute disaster, but we're ticking along okay. The shelves are full. We're still employed. In fact, there's reasons for positivity there that might not be caused by Brexit, but there's a lot of things to be optimistic about in terms of being a UK citizen. So I guess what a lot of people have said to me is, this probably is politically and legally an absolute dog's dinner. But have we all got the opportunity just to muddle along with our lives, enjoying ourselves, making the best of a bad job? Or are there actually hidden things which are going to impede us all as we move through our lives?
I always used to get very irritated at Remain campaigners sort of doom-mongering about the catastrophic impact of Brexit, as if it was going to be equivalent to some meteor hitting the country from outer space and obliterating everybody and everything. But Brexit was never going to be a one-off catastrophe. Brexit was always going to be a miserable, long-term process of inflicting thousands of minor injuries to oneself that over time reduce the capacity of the country to solve its problems, reduce the opportunities available to its citizens, reduce the power and influence that we enjoy in our neighborhood and on the world stage. It was always going to be about a sort of 10,000 cuts rather than one catastrophic, miserable experience. Does that make it any better? I doubt it. The standard I'd like us to set for ourselves as a country is not that we muddle along, making the best of a bad job and hoping that the world doesn't prematurely come to an end. If that's the height of the aspiration of global Britain, it's not a very high aspiration, is it? The problems with Brexit are essentially vast in number, but often small in scale individually. And the question is, which we will be working out for years to come, how does the accumulative effect of all of those little disasters actually impact upon people's lives and jobs? But it's not too early to already find out the examples of this. All you need to do is look at a sphere like musicians, professional musicians, because here we have a group of people who are engaged in the cross-border movement of goods, but they're also engaged in the cross-border provision of services, and they're also engaged in the cross-border movement of people, and they also have to worry about things like data. There are people who are actually affected by an accumulation of the impacts of Brexit. You find me a professional musician who doesn't think that Brexit is already a catastrophe for their income, for their lives, for their professions, and I would very much like to meet them and hear what their magic secret is.
I think the point we'll end on is, against that backdrop, this situation, this withdrawal from the EU is probably going to mean different things to different people, and that we perhaps the solution to it is not altogether apparent to me at this moment. But I think what is for sure, that we, until such time as we can all come together as a society, and that is reflected in government, the chances of us all moving forward together to lead the most prosperous life, both in work, at home, and in business, is a challenge. Michael, I want to thank you for joining us today on SWCC. It felt a good moment to pit stop and review Brexit 12 months on from our official surgical removal from the European Union. And you've provided us with a wonderful expert analysis of the various issues. It's been a pleasure talking to you, so thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Simon. It's been a pleasure.